Well, back to this evening. It's 10:15, just gone, and now on Radio 3, the historian Bettany Hughes begins a two-part series exploring the area known to us as the Caucasus, which sits between Europe and Asia and has had a significant influence on the imagination of the West. Bettany begins her journey on the historic road that crosses the mountains from Russia into the country of Georgia.
We've just left the Georgian military highway and are now struggling our way up the side of a ferocious mountain. Just to the west is the lawless breakaway region of South Ossetia, off limits to outsiders. To the northeast is the border with Russia and the bad lands of Chechnya and Dagestan, still seen as a breeding ground for terrorism 2 centuries after Russia first tried to pacify them. I'm heading somewhere arguably as dangerous. A place and an idea rooted deep in the collective imagination of Western civilization. This is a landscape imagined, fought over, fetishized and colonized by outsiders for millennia. The location of fevered hopes and of our darkest fears. This is the Caucasus. Across 3 millennia, the Caucasus has been an edgy character in the narrative of both East and West alike. Whether it's in the lines of ancient Greek and Roman literature, with news of violence and terrorist attacks on our television screens, or on medical forms, where you might be offered the option to describe yourself as white Caucasian, the Caucasus has long been perceived as civilization's shadow.
They imagine the Caucasus to be something majestic. Eternal virgin ice, rushing torrents, daggers, mantles, fair Circassians, and an atmosphere of terror and romance. But in reality, there is nothing amusing in it.
In the first part of this series, I'm investigating the Caucasus as imagined and experienced in antiquity, to see how stories from the edge of the known world have become our own. In many ways, this region was a realm of antiquity's subconscious, the locus of both imprisonment and liberation, a magical land, a place of promise and of punishment. And so I started my journey where the West's relationship with the Caucasus typically began, on the eastern reaches of the Black Sea coast. My view right now, looming boats that really mean business on the horizon behind, is the view that tellers of tales say was shared by one of the most tenacious heroes in the canon of mythology, Jason, together with his Argonauts. Jason's story is a textbook heroic quest. Set in the generation before the Trojan War, like the Odyssey, it's a story of a sea journey. Jason is sent to retrieve the Golden Fleece from King Aeetes, who ruled the remote kingdom of Colchis, or Aya as it was originally known, at the coastal edge of the Caucasus. He gathers together a crew of Argonauts, and they embark on what the ancients called the farthest journey, a journey to the end of the world.
Suddenly, a huge wave rose up before them, arched like a steep rock, and at the sight they bowed with bended heads. Then a vaulted billow rushed upon them, and the ship like a cylinder ran on the furious wave, plunging through the hollow sea. And the eddying current held her between the clashing rocks, and on each side they shook and thundered, and the ship's timbers were held fast. Then Athena, with her left hand, thrust back one mighty rock, and with her right pushed the ship through.
It's this tale of daring do that secured the Caucasus' reputation as an archetypal land of peril and exotic adventure. So, was it all made up? Or could there have been real historical Greeks who ventured here and returned with vivid travellers' tales? Just 300 or so metres inland from the Black Sea coast, I met Professor Vakhtang Licelli at Pichvanari, the site of one of his current excavations, to find out what hard evidence there might be behind the Jason myth. So we've left the beach behind, we've come in underneath some spreading oak trees, past an old lady collecting firewood in her wheelbarrow and a lot of cows, and the professor now seems to be leading me down a rather narrow path of brambles, so we're getting scratched. I'm presuming there's an interesting destination here.
Yes, yes.
Oh, look there it is. Can we go down into this?
Yes, please. So,
God, so this is completely different. Now suddenly in front of me there's a huge sandy pit with, I'd say, 15 probably dig sites, 15 trenches in here. So what is this that we're looking at now?
this is not a myth. This is Greek necropolis. We have a lot of Greek items from all those graves.
There is an interesting kind of thorny issue though with the chronology here, isn't there? Because if this is 5th century, so we're talking about the time that the so-called golden age of Athens, for instance, you know, the Peloponnesian War is happening. Yes. But the Jason myth precedes that by many centuries. So the myth could not have come from this settlement. It couldn't have arisen because the Greeks came here in the 5th century. It must relate to some kind of earlier either imagination or real connection between the two places.
Yes, behind of those trees, approximately 200 meters, there is a huge settlement of Bronze Age. So they totally correspond to the Mycenaean age and correspond to the Argonauts' age in Colchis chronologically.
And again, is there archaeology that proves there were people from the Greek world who had contact here?
We have not clear evidences of Mycenaean age pottery here, but on the territory of Georgia, generally speaking, we have Middle Bronze Age evidences having analogies on the territory of Greece. I think probably this is earliest evidence of some interrelation between Greek world and Caucasia.
So these are two worlds that know one another, and you suspect therefore are going to develop a bit of a fascination for one another. So some Greeks, it seems, did make it to the Caucasus, and once you're here you can understand why. This is one of the most mineral-rich and fertile regions on Earth. It does have the feel of a promised land. When Jason travelled from the Black Sea coast to the land of Aya, the land of the rising sun as Colchis was originally called, we're told he made the journey along the river Pharsis, incidentally where pheasants get their name. Now, without the blessing of either a boat or the Argonauts, I'm having to travel inland by road, and a lush subtropical landscape is opening up all around me. Colchis was perceived by the ancient Greeks to be both enticing and perilous, a kind of febrile end to the world. Aeetes, the father of Medea, was said to be the son of the sun, whose rebirth came, of course, every morning from the extreme east. But I think we've got to stop viewing this land through Hellenizing spectacles. For the natives, this wasn't a mysterious, mythical destination. This was home. One settlement from the period that's been partially excavated is Varni. That's definitely a storeroom. This is where all the material from the site is stored, is it? Some have argued that Varni is indeed the mythical capital of Colchis, stop-off place for Jason, the home of King Aeetes. And certainly the excavations here in the 1960s showed that this was a citadel fit for a wealthy, well-connected king. There might not be golden fleeces here, but there are rams aplenty on drinking cups, hearth irons and jewellery. So there are lots of very curious-looking creatures here. This is from some of the earliest levels of the find. Two-headed dogs, four-headed dogs, but then fairly realistic representation of a ram. But do we know what this was used for, Omar, this ram, and why we see rams so much from this time?
Because of the good it was doing to people in terms of its meat, in terms of everything. I mean, there are lots of them in the Caucasus. They used rams a lot during religious rituals.
And of course it becomes immortalised in the inevitable golden fleece that we all hear so much about and are taught of as children. In order to make my way up to the sacrificial centre, to the ritual heart of the site, I've had to cross through a poor old woman's little homestead, which is being very well protected by turkeys, as you can hear. So I have made it right up to the very top, and I'm just sheltering behind the welcoming boughs of a pomegranate tree up here. This is an extraordinary place, I have to say. This was really the beating heart of the ritual centre of the site. We're told that sacrifices were made here, and it's certainly where burial objects and votive offerings were found to the gods. I can see, for I would say hundreds of miles, there's flat, fertile farmland down below, and everything is ringed on the horizons by high mountains, so high that the clouds are sitting as little illuminated pillows beneath the peaks. There is actually an interesting theory as to why Jason was connected to sites like this. The local name, derived from the Persian for holy places, was Ayazana in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and the adventuring Greeks thought that sounded like their man Jason, so they presumed that this was a place where Jason once came. Standing here, this warm wind lifting my hair, the sound of the spirits and the leaves all around me, the leaves of the oaks and the pomegranates and the silver birch. This doesn't feel very Greek. This doesn't feel like Jason's place. This feels very Caucasian.
But of course, why Jason came, and why the flesh and blood Greeks came, was in part because of the stories of the gorgeous gold stockpiled in Caucasian settlements like this. All make-believe? Well, the evidence from Varney doesn't disappoint. In fact, the finds here are so many and so precious, they now have to be kept under lock and key in the National Museum in Georgia's capital, Tbilisi. The director, David Lord Kipanadze, showed me the treasures, originally excavated by his father.
So we're in a subterranean chamber, just these little display cabinets around the edges, and the gold is pulsing out of these. You can really kind of feel the warmth of the gold in this room. What an amazing collection.
Yeah, what we have here are gold from Varney, which really shows that myth about Colchis was not just myth. Here in western Georgia, Greeks really discovered new country, which was already developed country. And I would say that it's not just country rich with resources, country where they found some high culture.
If we go and have a look at some of the particular finds, I mean, you were a child when your father was physically digging this stuff up out of the earth. I mean, are there any objects on display here that are particularly resonant for you?
You know, if you will ask me where is the best evidence of the Colchis rich with gold, is the showcase. It comes from just one burial. This burial has been found in 1969. It seems that it belonged to the high aristocracy and to the woman, it's definitely. And this necklace, which you can see here with this tortoise representation, which is 33, turtles here, and it's one of the most fantastic jewelry I ever, not just me, ever seen.
I mean, I agree. I mean, this is an absolute feast for the eyes. So what we have in front of us are necklaces, headdresses, hair adornments, a kind of snaking loop of gold. And the detail on these is really exceptional. I mean, that tortoise necklace that you're talking about, they are perfect
they are.
tortoises formed into a kind of, wonderful bit of jewellery.
Yeah, it's the first feeling always, wow, is it so old? And you can see here influence from Greece, you can see influence from Persian part, but you can see own identity, which are unique here.
Dare I ask you about the golden fleece?
Yeah, of course. The golden fleece for me is not just one example, just one object. I think golden fleece is something narrative, finding something new. And I think this is, for me, golden fleece. The biggest adventurers, Greeks, they came to find out something new.
So the golden fleece is both a physical and a metaphysical idea.
I totally agree.
But of course it's here we meet a crucial Caucasian trope. A homegrown creature who will bring trouble to outsiders, and a woman who is arguably the most compelling character in this whole tale. It is Aietes' daughter, the witch Circe's niece, Jason's lover, Princess Medea. Without her, Jason would have failed in all of his tasks, including the theft of that golden fleece. And whereas our Pavlovian response might be to think of Medea as a sorceress, the deranged mother who murdered her own children and poisoned her rivals, driven wild with grief, even today, Medea still commands great affection and respect in Georgia. Medea is a highly popular name for girls. Here in Batumi, a Greek settlement from the 8th century BC, a 50-foot high statue of Medea dominates the redeveloped port, reaching her arms out to the west. In fact, the statue of this prehistoric princess incarnates Georgia's campaign for closer links to Europe, a counterbalance to the attentions of their powerful northern neighbour, Russia. David Braund.
The myth's taken on a whole new life because in a kind of slightly uncomfortable way, perhaps, it connects Georgia into the world of Greek myth, and therefore establishes a link into the whole business of Georgia being European. And it was presumably with that in mind that the Georgian government of Saakashvili, for example, somewhere in the late 90s, I think, put a large statue of Medea herself in the town of Batumi, stretching out, holding the golden fleece. It shows you just how flexible Greek myth can be, and how, because of that flexibility almost, it can retain a kind of relevance and gain a new life as the world around us changes.
It seems the Georgians are justified in claiming a feisty, strong-willed woman as some kind of godmother to their nation. I'd heard that behind the scenes in the storerooms of the museum were finds from a female grave dating back to 1000 BC, including a spectacular sword. Archaeologist Yulon Gagoshidze agreed to take me deep into their vaults.
So what is this that you've got out for me here? Yeah.
Look.
Can I hold it?
Yes, why not?
That, I'm very excited. I'm really genuinely excited. What is the date of this?
It's 8th century BC.
And this was found in the grave of a woman?
Yes.
So we think this was her sword?
Yes, because look, you can see her skull.
So it's a tiny skull in the bottom of a very old cardboard box covered in tissue paper. Do we know how she died?
No, we don't know, but she was 30 or 35 years old.
I have to say my heart is actually beating faster, because we talk so often about warrior women and did they exist, and here in front of me on this leather-covered table in this storeroom is hard evidence. There's no doubt this was a woman who would have borne arms.
No doubt, yes.
Have you given her a name?
No.
We should name her today.
Bettany, maybe?
Oh, honestly, my life would be complete
Natalie
if you named her Bettany.
You could be her godmother.
I will be her
Her
godmother.
bracelets,
Oh, beautiful. What are they made of?
bronze bracelets.
Yes. Actually tiny. She had quite little wrists. Yeah. Yes, beautiful.
Yeah.
Can I just ask one, why do you think this is happening here? Because it is unusual to find women as fighters from this period. What's different about this region?
It's hard to tell. You know, the fact is that all those legends and myths about Amazons, they come from around this area, so probably that wasn't accidental, that wasn't just a random thing. Well, today Georgian women are very, very active, and so maybe, that is the continuation of that.
So the feisty tradition continues. I'm pleased to hear it. This find is just one of over 300 graves of warrior women excavated in recent years from the Black Sea region and the steppes of Russia. It's not hard to see a link between a culture where women rode horses and fought in battle and the myth of a race of warrior women living in all-female tribes. The stories certainly abound. The Amazon queen Penthesilea is a protagonist in the Trojan War. Hercules steals the girdle of Hippolyta as one of his 12 labours. Furious Amazons were even said to have besieged Athens after Theseus carried off their ruler, Antiope. It made sense to the ancient Greek mythological worldview that these inversions of normal gender roles would be located in the perilous Caucasus. Adrienne Mayer, research scholar at Stanford University.
In Greek mythology, the Amazons were often imagined as a society of women only. But that soon raises questions on how did they reproduce themselves, how do they perpetuate themselves. So there were stories about perhaps they had men that they kept as slaves, perhaps they maimed little boys or killed them or got rid of them somehow and only raised girls, but then to perpetuate their tribe of all women, they would meet on a seasonal basis with neighboring tribes and have a sort of Woodstock moment in the summertime with these other Scythian tribes, all sorts of speculations. What's interesting is that the archaeology does not show any evidence of all-female societies, of course. These were women who rode alongside the men, and they had an egalitarian society. And if you think about it, it's the horses and archery that were the great equalizers for men and women in those groups. If everyone learned to ride a horse and shoot a bow and arrow at a very young age, they're all dressing the same because it's practical attire for horse riding and a harsh life on the steppes. A woman on a horseback with a quiver and a bow can be just as fast, just as deadly as a man.
And it looks increasingly clear that the Greeks really did know some of the truth of these tribes. Specific details on Greek vase paintings are now being matched by archaeological evidence coming fresh out of the earth.
The Amazons were shown wearing wildly patterned leggings and trousers, tunics, long sleeves, carrying battle axes with a very sharp ice pick point at one end. They're always shown with bows and arrows and quivers full of arrows, and they're often shown on horseback. And in fact, all these details are confirmed by the archaeological discoveries in the Ukraine and southern Russia and in the Caucasus. Some of them even have bits of their clothing, so we can see that they were dressed in tunics with wild patterns and leggings and trousers and boots, carrying battle axes and bows and quivers, just like those portrayed in the Greek vases.
To the average ancient Greek man, the Amazon would have commanded a kind of dangerous allure. But that might not be the only reason for their popularity.
Well, you know, there's a lot of speculation about why Amazon stories and images were so very popular, wildly popular in ancient Greek art. Everyone knew these stories. I don't think there's any doubt that they serve some sort of symbolic purpose, psychological purpose, but we also have to keep in mind that women and girls were listening to these stories and looking at the pictures too. So, and we don't know much about what they thought. I think for the men it was a very thrilling and daunting idea that there might be women out there who would be their equals. But we find images of Amazons on women's perfume vases in Greece, on their jewelry boxes, on their weaving supplies, and there are even some little clay dolls that were buried with young Greek girls. So I think that both men and women in classical Greece like to dream about more freedom for women and the fact that there could be somewhere an egalitarian society.
It's heartening to know that despite their enclosed and often cauterised lives, an ancient Greek girl's version of Barbie may have been a doll of a Caucasian queen. Leaving my Amazons in the National Museum in Tbilisi, I found myself in the middle of Georgia's annual festival of the new wine, the Christian version of a pagan original. There's hard evidence here of the cultivation of the vine stretching back at least 8,000 years. The land here is remarkably fertile and rich in minerals too. Every year, archaeological digs reveal the prehistoric production of high-grade gold, copper, bronze, zinc and mercury. For the outside world, it would have seemed as though technological miracles were being worked in this remote territory. One of the most popular stories about the region described a man who had dared to dabble in the dark arts of fire and of metal production. The Caucasus Mountains were the setting for the captivity of Prometheus. Nailed to rocks by Zeus with iron rivets, an eagle devouring his liver every day for the crime of stealing the secret of fire from the gods and giving it to men. There was no place more bleak in the Greeks' imagination.
Searching for the reality of myths can be a specious exercise, but it is always interesting to try to work out why they are located in certain places. Wherever I travel in the Caucasus, whether it be on the roads or a pathway up here where I am now, surrounded by woods with a ferocious rock behind me, you find eagles. And standing here in the chill and this unforgiving landscape, I really feel for Prometheus's pain, a pain described by many ancient authors, including Aeschylus, the 5th century playwright. This is fragment 107 from Prometheus Unbound. Behold me, Prometheus, fettered, clamped to these rough rocks. Thus hath Zeus, the son of Cronos, fastened me, and to the will of Zeus
has Hephaestus lent his hand. With cruel art has he riven my limbs by driving in these bolts. Ah, unhappy that I am. And now, each third woeful day, with dreadful swoop, the minister of Zeus with his hooked talons rends me asunder. Then, crammed and glutted to the full on my fat liver, he utters a prodigious scream and, soaring aloft with winged tail, fawns upon my gore. But when my gnawed liver swells, renewed in growth, greedily doth he return anew. Thus do I feed this guardian of my awful torture, who mutilates me living with never-ending pain. And this, my ancient, dolorous agony, intensified by the dreadful centuries, is fastened upon my body, from which there fall, melted by the blazing sun, drops that unceasingly pour upon the rocks of Caucasus.
For once, though, this might not be an interloper myth, a disparaging projection onto the Caucasian landscape. Prometheus could possibly have a homegrown cousin, a rebellious local hero called Amirami. In the mountains, I asked Giga Zidania, rector of Ilia State University, what he thought this tortured figure represents.
It's not the myth which is unique to Greek mythology. The version of this myth exists in Georgian mythology as well, with exactly the same elements, with rebellion and also with being punished by being changed to the mountains, and these mountains are, of course, the Caucasus Mountains.
This local version of Prometheus, how closely are the two stories connected? How similar are they?
They definitely have same topics. Basically, they are about rebellion against gods, and about being imprisonment. What is lacking in Amirani story is this positive side of bringing fire to the people. It's not in the Georgian myth. But this Amirani myth would become inspiration for thousands of Georgian writers who would compare chained Amirani to Georgia, which is to be freed from the domination of foreign powers, including the Russian one. And so they would look forward to the time when Amirani would be freed and Georgia would be freed. So this is the spell over the Georgian imagination this Amirani myth has.
Giger believes that the Prometheus story has been used by Russians and Georgians alike to define and determine their relationship with the region.
What I find particularly interesting is how the topics which are in part of this myth have continued to travel down history. And this is the topic of rebellion, the topic of captivity, of course, have exercised a very surprising power on the writers, let's say in 19th or 20th centuries. For example, the topic of captivity and freedom and rebellion will define the 19th century writers in Russian literature or 20th century cinema, etc.
Incidentally, the tale of Jason too has an interesting life story. There's one argument that its popularity endured because it offered a kind of fantasy precedent for the efforts of Greek colonisers from around 700 BC. Professor David Braund, author of Georgia in Antiquity.
The myth is much older than any sense of Greek settlement. So I don't think we can see the myth itself as caused by Greek settlement in the Black Sea or anywhere else. But what we probably can, I think certainly can imagine, is that the colonists who go out to the Black Sea, who go to create a home for themselves in, say, Colchis itself, or elsewhere around the Black Sea, or really anywhere around the ancient world, they go to make a new home for themselves, and there's a sense in which they are Argonauts. They are going into the Black Sea, for example, through that famously narrow entrance past what is now Istanbul. They are braving the clashing rocks of the myth in that way. They are open to real dangerous locals who might possibly kill them. So there's a huge challenge to going off to create a new world, a new home in some distant part. And the Argonautic myth expressed that very nicely.
The Greeks might have been the first, but they were certainly not the last to employ the Jason myth as a justification for colonisation. In the 19th century, after the Russian conquest of the region, a popular mural in Tbilisi, the arrival of the Argonauts in Colchis, portrayed the Greeks as a civilised race, coming to tame the barbarian natives. And conveniently, the Argonauts' faces were in fact portraits of Russian leaders. In the Soviet era, the Georgian novelist Otar Chiladze retold the story from the Colchian perspective. The gung-ho Argonauts now bearing a distinct resemblance to communist leaders. And the trope continues worldwide. Jason Colavito, author of Jason and the Argonauts Through the Ages.
The myth of Jason and the Argonauts became a way that Europeans were able to understand and interpret the New World. Just as Jason had traveled to the farthest east and discovered the Golden Fleece, the Spanish said that they had traveled to the farthest west, where they discovered the riches and gold of the New World. In fact, you find that the Spanish used the myth of Jason and the Argonauts to explain how they were dealing with all of the wealth that they found in Peru and in Mexico. They explicitly related the gold of the Inca to the Golden Fleece and talked about themselves as the new Argonauts.
The story of Prometheus tells of the dread consequences of defying the gods. Now I'm driving south from Georgia in pursuit of another foundational myth. This time, it's the story of a man who dared to do God's will. Now employing the very technical knowledge that condemned Prometheus to eternal torment, Noah piously directed his manly boat-building skills to save God's creation. And the fruit of his labour, that impossibly capacious ark, is said to have ended up on the peak of the mountain I'm heading to now, Mount Ararat.
Interestingly, this is a region where the locals don't call themselves Caucasian. In fact, the term is seen as an insult, a derogatory phrase used by Russian invaders over the centuries to mark out the inhabitants of the Caucasus as somehow uncultured, backward, primitive. Yet it's almost as if this is a region where there are so many fundamental human stories rattling around. We need to find a box big enough to transport or to store them all in. And so the Caucasus mountain range casts its shadow as far as Mount Ararat, just over the border from Armenia in modern-day Turkey. It's from this geographical perspective that we get another perception of the region. Rather than it being a foreign land, here it's a biblical homeland.
And God remembered Noah, and every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. And the waters returned from off the earth continually. And after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat.
I've made my way out onto a rocky promontory overlooking Mount Ararat. I feel pretty solitary here. There are just a couple of distant hill walkers I can see, looking like they're being chased by a stray dog. But this is a place that travellers have always come. Byron, interestingly, that man who travelled far and wide, never actually made it to Armenia, but he was mildly obsessed with the place, in particular the language. He taught himself Armenian. He said that he found his mind wanted something craggy to break upon, and that Armenian would torture him into attention. When he focuses on the country, though, he really concentrates on the scriptural connections to the place.
If the scriptures are rightly understood, it was in Armenia that paradise was placed. Armenia, which has paid as dearly as Adam for that fleeting participation of its soil in the happiness of him who was created from its dust. It was in Armenia that the flood first abated and the dove first alighted. But with disappearance of paradise itself may be dated the unhappiness of the country. For though long a powerful kingdom, it was scarcely ever an independent one, and the satraps of Persia and pashas of Turkey have alike desolated the region where God created man in his own image.
The identification of this particular mountain with its biblical counterpart was popularised by Roman authors and then Marco Polo in the 13th century. Ever since, committed travellers and pilgrims have come here in search of Noah's Ark. I met Armenian historian Haik Hakobian at the foot of the mountain. Explain to me how Mount Ararat was connected to the Ararat of the Bible and to Noah.
There are two Ararats in Armenian highlands. One of them, Judidar, near the basin of Tigris, and another one, this Ararat. Maybe initially for Shumers and others, the initial Mount Ararat was that Judidar. But all Christian world decided this is that Bible Ararat. So this is Christian decision of Christian world, not only Armenians. That mount which connects with the flood.
So what do you think about those archaeologists who actually lead expeditions up Mount Ararat to try to find the Ark?
Now there are Chinese, American, English, Spanish archaeologists. I think any shrine could be built there by Armenians and other Christians near the top of Ararat. That's why Navarra and others can find some wooden constructions. But as a scholar, I believe it is legend, very nice legend. I was climbing up to Olympus. No any old constructions. Also here.
So there's interesting archaeology here, but a completely specious exercise to look for Noah's Ark.
Yes.
But as ever in the Caucasus, the legend is as strong as the reality, as I found when passing the monastery of Mount Ararat, built beneath the sacred mountain. Hello. So this is a total surprise. I'm making my way up to Mount Ararat Monastery, and there's a gentleman who's offering me a white dove. Why am I being offered this?
So the idea is to take the bird and to let it to fly, to make a dream in a mind. Then it will come true. So the dove helps to come true.
And is this a sacred thing? Are you sending up a prayer with a dove, or just a wish?
So he's explaining and connecting this process with Noah when he lets the dove go, and it comes back with the olive leaf, and he's connecting this with this myth.
Lovely. So this little dove is a descendant of that first dove that left from Mount Ararat.
So this is how he explains.
I think I have to have one.
You can choose whichever you want.
I like the one he's holding in his hand. Thank you very much.
You should come. You should stay here in the middle to look to the cross on the church, and then to make the wish and leave it.
Yeah, I can feel this poor little dove's heart beating. So I am going to send him off, actually with a Babylonian prayer. So the Babylonians used to say Anashulmi u Balatu, to peace and to life, and that feels to me like a pretty good message to send with this dove. So off he or she goes. These myths become like clothes, whether exotic or homespun, that Caucasians themselves end up wearing. Locals, like the dove seller, make a living from immortalising Caucasian tales, even if his only reward are a few Armenian dram a day. That perception of the Caucasus as a lost homeland, a Garden of Eden, was to have increasing impact on the 18th and 19th centuries. This was when European thinkers started to concoct a theory of race. If you were looking for the origins of humanity, where better to start than the Caucasus? Join me next week to discover how white people came to be known as Caucasian, how the perceived beauty of the natives of the region sold everything from face cream to slaves for the Sultan's harem. And we'll also be finding out how the Russian conquest of the territory nourished the defining literature of Pushkin, Lermontov and Tolstoy.
Caucasian Roots was presented by Bettany Hughes and produced by Russell Finch. It was a Somethin Else production for BBC Radio 3, first broadcast earlier this year. And just to say, you can download the programme as well as all our other features by going to the Radio 3 website. The second part of the series is here on Radio 3 at 9:30 tomorrow evening.